It's time for us to check back in with A People and Their Quilts. If you've missed any of the previous readings, just look in the description below for a playlist. Dark was falling fast over the stark ridges of Anderson County, Tennessee on a cold January afternoon. Robert Smith of Brimes Fort came forward carrying a big bucket of water. He had been to the spring across the road at the foot of the ridge to fetch water for drinking and cooking. He was asked if his wife Jetty ever made quilts. "She's made a many a quilt," he laughed, "but she don't make 'em anymore. We can go in and see what she's got." Inside the log house, Jetty was sitting by the coal-burning stove in the single room in which they lived. The house had a second room, but it had long ago been converted to a storage room to replace the smokehouse and woodshed that had fallen down. The small room was warm, compact, and very comfortable. It was as much room as they needed. Jetty was the daughter of Tobe Hutchison, whose home was a few miles from where Robert and Jetty have spent their married life. "We was raised," Jetty said, "in what they called Poor Land Valley." When asked about her quilting, she replied, "Well, I started helping my mother quilt when I was about 8 years old. We'd quilt for people, and we'd charge by the spool. We'd charge $1 for every spool of thread we used, and it generally take us about a week to use up a spool of thread quilting that way." Jetty was asked how many quilts she thought she had made. "Oh, I don't know how many I've made. It'd be a sight to see 'em if they was all in a pile." A few days after this talk with Jetty, a lady from Ohio told me that she belonged to a club which did contract quilting, and that their charge was 20 cents per yard of thread used, and that there was 500 yards of thread in a spool. This would amount to $100, or 100 times more than Jetty received for her sewing. Jetty, who was born in 1912, continued to make quilts after she was grown, and until 1928, when she started working for Standard Knitting Mill in Knoxville. She worked 6 days per week, 10 hours per day, and received $16 for the 60-hour week. In comparison to what she had been getting for quilting, she felt that this was good money. Jetty worked in various cotton mills in the Knoxville area until 1943. Then she went back to quilting. She made 3 or 4 quilts each year for several years, but hasn't started one recently. Almost all of her quilts were made from animal feed sacks, flour sacks, and scrap material. She has also used the little cloth tobacco sacks for the quilt backing. In the winter of 1983, Lucy Stooksbury was the lone occupant of a rambling old farmhouse in the ridge country of Anderson County, Tennessee. In one of the back bedrooms, now seldom used, stood an unusual walnut bed made by her great-grandfather Hill. Upon this bed, serving as a bed cover or spread, was a fine old quilt made by Lucy's grandmother. Lucy no longer used the room, the bed, or the quilt, so she sold the quilt, and it was added to the collections at the Museum of Appalachia. When actress Jane Fonda visited the museum, she saw the quilt and asked to purchase it for her own use. Along with it, she received an account of its history and a picture of Lucy standing by it. This quilt, made in a small log cabin in the Tennessee mountains 100 years ago, is indicative of the warm appeal American quilts have for so many people. A woman who had been confined to a mental institution in Nashville for over 60 years, since she was a teenager, made numerous quilts, principally from bed sheets. She unraveled towels, washcloths, and rags for the colored thread she used to create the various designs. The staff didn't quite know what to do with her creations, so they sold them for a few dollars on behalf of the persevering quilter. Dr. Nat Winston, who served as the Tennessee Commissioner of Mental Health, bought one and had all but forgotten it until he had gone through his good quilts, then remembered having this one packed away. Although each of the 9 squares is different, there are similarities: the flag, people, and chickens. He remembered that the people were purported to represent doctors and nurses who treated the quilter, and that the relative size of their likeness on the quilt symbolized her regard for them. The institution included a farm, which this may explain her use of chickens. The quilt as folk art. One of the basic innate human traits is the desire to be remembered, and quite naturally to be remembered in a fond and complimentary way. Perhaps that is one of the reasons people paint, build edifices, strive to be the president of the company, acquire a fine farm, have their pictures made, arrange to have a headstone erected, write their memoirs, and make quilts. Few people like to think that their passing from this earth will go totally unnoticed, or as the country song says, with not a trace left behind. The men in our society have traditionally had an opportunity, or at least a hope, that they would have a chance to leave some evidence of their existence, their farm, their business, the houses they had built, the chimneys they had laid, the devices they had invented, and most of all, the children that bore their name. But the women could hope for no such remembrances. Until recently, they could have little or no hope of leaving any reminders of their passage through this world. Very often, the only kind of permanent recognition a woman got was through a beautiful and expertly sewn quilt. Many quilts, especially in the days of housekeeping, were made purely for everyday use, and no pretense was made to make them pretty. They were among many on a bed, seldom seen, and used constantly until they were threadbare. After there were enough quilts to satisfy the needs of the family, the women could take the time for a more aesthetic and leisurely approach to quilt making. Instead of sewing the scraps of various sizes and colors together as they were randomly removed from the scrap bag, why not match the colors in some sort of a pleasing manner, perhaps even form them into some pattern? While sewing the 3 layers together, a practical and necessary chore, why not sew or quilt these stitches in an artful design? During the evolutionary process of quilt making, the artistic aspect, both in piecing and in quilting, became more and more important. Eventually, 2 practices developed. There was more emphasis and more work devoted to making a quilt beautiful than in making it serviceable. Secondly, some quilts were made exclusively for special occasions, for show, and for gifts. They were never intended for the beds of rowdy children, unbathed old men, or untrained infants. When our great-grandmothers made a beautiful quilt of this type and packed it away in their quilt chest, they had completed a work of art. They were not trained in color schemes, pattern creation, or needlework, and never even thought of the work as art, but they were true folk artists. Those hard-working housewives from the dirt-floored log houses of Kentucky, the wind-swept prairies of the eastern Dakotas, the sod houses of Kansas, the adobes of Arizona, and the lumber cabins of Oregon doubtless produced more true folk art than any other single group in this country's history. Nor were quilters confined to housewives in isolated and rural areas. Indeed, some of the most exquisite quilts were made by wives of the affluent in the villages and urban centers. The extent to which these old quilts have stood the test of time, the phenomenal nationwide interest in them, the heretofore unheard of prices, and their use as decorative items in some of the country's most tastefully decorated homes are tributes to the overworked housewives who designed and made them. They confidently recognize their beauty, but it has taken a couple of generations for their descendants to rediscover this beauty. Rural America generally did not practice art for art's sake. Scholars argue as to why this is true, but in a land where there was a constant struggle to maintain the necessities of life, engaging in an activity merely to create something pretty was just not practical. Quilting fulfilled both needs. Making a quilt was an honorable thing to do, indeed a necessary task. Who could be critical of one who, while making something so essential, also added some art in color or design? It is ironic that these women, in effect, had to bootleg or sneak their beautiful artwork into their quilts. There is no question that many, perhaps most, of their husbands would have forbidden them to have engaged in quilt making if they had thought the quilts were made purely for art's sake. The point might be made that a quilt is not true folk art if it were based on a borrowed pattern, as was most often the case. Many knowledgeable quilters will be quick to point out that the vast differences in the color scheme, the adaptation of the pattern, the border, and dozens of little things that reveal the creativity and the artistic qualities of the quilter are sufficient to put even this type of quilt into the category of folk art. Carter Huick, editorial director of the magazine Ladies' Circle Patchwork Quilts, states that out of frugality and necessity, the great American piecework quilt, our true folk art, was born. Dr. Robert Bishop, author of several books related to quilts and to folk art, says, almost from the day it was finished, a quilt or sampler was admired and treasured. Little wonder, for the best handmade American textiles were not only masterfully executed and functional, but are considered works of art. Not only are quilts now being recognized as works of art, but perhaps for the first time in our country's history, they are being treated as such. In the April 1983 issue of the magazine Metropolitan Life, the cover page called attention to a story of folk art. The very first folk art object shown, more prominently than any other in this article, was an old quilt. Two ingredients of folk art are the pleasing aspect of the object and the homemade, self-styled, and personal manner in which it was made. Elliot Wigginton, editor of the Foxfire books, once stated, "A quilt is something human. Quilts were handmade by people for people. Every phase of their production was permeated by giving and sharing." There is a long-standing argument over whether or not fine quilts should actually be used. For a long time, the daughters-in-law, nieces, and grandchildren ridiculed poor old Aunt Sally for keeping her beautiful treasures stored away in an upstairs chest. What an absurd practice, the younger folk thought. Aunt Sally was viewed as being a little peculiar and maybe a little senile. True, she readily showed her quilts to prospective admirers and to family members. She would even use them on a few occasions, at Christmas, for a wedding, or when some family member died, but otherwise they lay folded neatly in the walnut chest that was older even than the quilts. "If you don't ever use them," the popular and repetitious question to Aunt Sally was, "then what good are they?" And the question, it seems, is not without merit. But if Aunt Sally and millions of her ilk had not so carefully stored and preserved these treasures of the past, if she and her comrades had used them on a daily basis, as they were encouraged to do, these treasures would not be around for us to admire today. If they had been made solely for use and comfort and been needed for that purpose, then it would have been foolish not to have used them. But if, on the other hand, they were works of art, as Aunt Sally thought but didn't verbalize, then she was right in preserving them. The contents of the following will illustrates in a most profound way how much one lady thought of her quilts. The will was discovered by Mrs. Lewis F. Marjorie Parsley of Oak Ridge while searching for genealogical records in the Anderson County Courthouse in Clinton, Tennessee. "In the name of God, amen. I, Nancy Yarnell, of the County of Anderson and State of Tennessee, being of sound mind and compassing memory and considering the uncertainty of this mortal life, knowing that it is appointed unto all once to die, do make and publish this my last will and testament, hereby revoking all others heretofore made by me in the words and figures following. Viz. In this first place, I will that all my just debts be paid, if any. In the second place, I will to Nancy Melinda Yarnell, one Massell quilt and one German rose coverlid. I also will to Joseph Samuel Yarnell, one patched quilt and one 25 snowball coverlid. The remainder of all my estate, both real and personal, I will to my sister Elizabeth Yarnell during her life, and after death to her heirs, and in order that this will be lawfully executed, I appoint Robert M. Yarnell, my executor, to execute this my last will and testament, whereof I have hereunto set my hand and affixed my seal this 27th of May, 1876. Her, Nancy X. Yarnell, Mark. It is highly interesting to note that Nancy chose to make arrangements for the disposition of her quilts even before she designated who was to be the recipient of her real estate, which is believed to have consisted of 40 acres and a dwelling house. It may also be noted that she mentioned to personal possessions other than her quilts and her coverlets. Nancy was apparently unable to read or write, as she signed her name with an X, which was her mark. Almost all old quilts, and some not so old, may be considered to have some or all the elements necessary to qualify them as folk art. Hence, the inclusion of certain quilts in this chapter is quite arbitrary. If folk art consists of personal artistic expressions of the common people done by folk with no formal training, then the quilts included herein qualify, but so would many others found throughout the book. Earl Blackwell's Historic Quilts. When Earl Blackwell was disabled with advanced emphysema, he took up wood carving, stone sculpturing, and quilting. Like most so-called folk artists, Earl could give no clue as to what prompted him to take up such an avocation, except that he liked to be doing something. Even when he became so weak and short of breath that he was confined to bed, Earl was busy at something. As a matter of fact, most of his quilt work was done as he lay propped up in his bed. In later years, Earl lived at the foot of Cumberland Mountain near the town of Jacksboro, Campbell County, Tennessee, but he was born in Clairfield, a most remote coal mining section of that county on the Kentucky line. His father started working in the coal mines at age 12 and was disabled at 45 because of miner's asthma or black lung. Earl worked as a miner, farmer, and trucker. He also worked for the coal companies in non-mining activities in Tennessee and in infamous bloody Harlan County, Kentucky. Earl spent 4 months completing each of these quilts using a type of liquid embroidery. His wife then spent 3 months quilting each one. There are literally dozens of symbols relating to the state, the federal government, and to Southern Appalachian culture on the bicentennial quilt. Included are the United States and the Tennessee flags, the American bald eagle, the state flower, the state tree, and state bird, and such indigenous things as a log cabin, a wash kettle, a rail fence, a hog-eaten, acorns, overalls hanging on the line, and many more. The Trees and Lake quilt may represent Norris Lake, which is located only a few miles from where Earl once lived. The fascinating feature of this quilt is that the forest is composed of different kinds of trees, and the leaves of each are remarkably similar to the actual leaves of the trees which they represent. To the casual observer, the leaves may appear to be just the same, just as various trees in a forest may appear indistinguishable one from another. To a person who knows trees, however, there are realistic and distinguishable differences. Earl identified the following trees on the quilt: magnolia, chestnut oak, cottonwood, walnut, sweet gum, white oak, weeping willow, elm, cedar, 2 chestnut trees with chestnuts, hickory, buckeye, and a pawpaw tree. Earl died about 1979, but more recently, Mrs. Blackwell explained why Earl decided to make the quilts and what prompted the various artwork. Well, he just picked it up. He didn't have nothing to go by when he was drawing all them things. He just had the idea in his head. Granny Irwin's Christmas quilt. Granny Irwin was one of 2 girls in a family with 11 children. Her sister, a good deal older, married and left home when Granny was young. Hence, she and her mother cooked, washed, sewed, and otherwise did the women's work for her 9 brothers and her father. They also did the milking, much of the gardening, and the canning and drying of all the food. Granny was a prodigious worker, even in her 80s, and had little time for frilly, artsy things. It was surprising to find this purely aesthetic Christmas quilt which she had made. Perhaps she would have done more of this type of work if time had permitted. Her son, shown here, later commented, "I always thought it was the prettiest quilt I ever saw, but the only time she ever used it was around Christmas time. She'd get it out a few days before Christmas and use it as a bed cover till around the first of the year, then she'd put it away for another year. She made it, I think, about the time she was married in the late 1890s. The embroidery subjects on this typical Victorian crazy quilt are in relatively high relief and include animals and family items found on the farm, homestead, where Granny Irwin lived. The Lord's Prayer is symbolically featured as the central motive. There is a dog, a butterfly, a horse, a bird, a goose, and chickens, including a colorful and strutting rooster. Granny always liked music, so it wasn't surprising to find a fiddle and a Jew's harp. There are several names and initials of the young women who may have helped her make it. There is a God Bless Our Family inscription and a terse, revealing, and somewhat sad sentiment expressed in two simple words: remember me. No one who ever knew Granny Irwin, who was called Aunt Sarah by all who knew her, could ever forget her. The jolly, energetic little lady who literally spent her life doing for others. We'll stop right there. Those beautiful crazy quilts are for sure among my favorites. I just love it. I love the artistic part. I love the thought that must have went into it, and then the laying it all out to where it would actually, fit together. I'm never a quilter. I've shared that. I can barely sew on a button's about all I can do. But I used to like, when I was a kid, to draw all these swirly designs and then color them different colors. And to me, that's what the crazy quilt really reminds me of. Interesting at the first part of this, the couple that he was visiting there, and the lady Jetty that didn't quilt anymore, but she had in the past. Really interesting to me how he described their house, about it being so small but being exactly what they needed. Of course, in those days, houses were so small compared to the way we live today. Even my house, which is modest in today's standards, would have been thought like just crazy big in those days. But made me think the way he described their house as being so cozy, and her sitting there by the stove and everything they needed. They did have that extra room, but then they had used it for storage. It reminded me of today's, the crazy fad, or maybe not even a fad now, maybe a necessity of tiny homes, how people that live in tiny homes, some people want to do that so they don't have as many possessions to worry about, get rid of some of their materialistic side of life, I guess you would say. But then also, I don't know if it's like this in your area, but in my area, there's so many people now that live in campers. And I think that's more of it. Might be a few people that are like that, just wanting to live very simply. But for a lot of people, I think it's more of an economic situation. But I was struck by that, like how he was describing them at that time. Definitely they would have become called really poor, probably, maybe even living in poverty. And then today, how there's people that really desire that sort of life. Not the poverty part, but the simplicity, I guess, is what I was thinking of. Now, one thing in this part of the book that maybe I don't agree with John about is that the way he talks about women really wanting to be remembered, and I understand that part. I want to be remembered, but that they weren't really. He's saying, I would disagree with that. I would say that the number one thing most women are remembered for is by their children, just by being their mother, being their mama, So I kind of see that differently than he does, and I would say for most women that's what they want to be remembered. They want their children to remember that they did for them, and they loved them and took care of them, and I think they were favorably remembered, even in those days when he is right about that. Women didn't have the same, maybe if you want to say rights or same opportunities when it comes to an economic sense as men did, certainly. And most of the time the men made the decisions, and all those kind of things are certainly true. But even in those days, I've just heard so many heartwarming stories from people that, and you can read them in books, even people you didn't know, go back to the 1800s or the 1700s, and the love that they had for their mother, who did this, who fed them, who held them at their breast, all those beautiful sentiments. So I kind of disagree with him on that part. And then as far as being remembered for stuff, like I said, I guess that is a human thing. I don't really think about that much, what I'll be remembered for. Again, if somebody asked me, I'd say, well, I want to be remembered for being a good person, and for being a good mother, and a good wife, a good sister, a good friend, a good daughter. Those are the things I would think of. It is funny, one time when I had first started writing The Blind Pig and the Acorn, Pap and Paul told me, I don't remember why this come up, if maybe someone had told me they thought they appreciated what I was doing or trying to do or whatever. but they both were teasing me but laughing about it. Said, well, you probably be famous for it, Tipper, but you'll probably be dead before you already ever are. Like it'll take that long for somebody to actually realize that you tried to celebrate Appalachian heritage, which is, they were just teasing me. That was funny. I did really like what he was bringing out, the point of the creativity and the necessity, like, things that were necessary, like those quilts were necessary. So women, of course, would take that opportunity to, or the men, the last little part there we read was a man who quilted, but that they would take the opportunity to make, even in the necessity, things that you had to have, like a quilt. Makes me think of chimneys and building and those kind of things. But you had to have those things, but why not be creative? Why not be artistic? I've seen old chimneys at old home places, and you can just really see the craftsmanship, and that whoever laid those rocks were proud of that. And maybe sometimes they would put a decorative type of rock in a certain place, like a center or something. You can just you can hear that or see that in those, but hear it in their, if you've ever been around anybody who's a craftsman, kind of hear it in their voice. I would hear that from Granny, whether she was making a quilt, something she crocheted, even something, think about flowers, planting a garden and stuff, when the rows are all neat and nice, or the flower just blooms beautifully and you planted it. So I love that, looking for the beauty in necessity. I really try to look at life like that, so that part really jumped out at me, and I love that, the beauty, finding beauty in the necessity of everyday things. And I had a friend tell me one time, at the end of the day, it is those little, at the end of your life, it is those little everyday things that matter the most. It's not the always the best promotion or the year you made the most money or whatever. It is in the day-to-day stuff that you spend with your family, or maybe that coffee cup you drink out of every morning, or your little schedules that you go through at home, whether it's washing clothes or whatever it is, that's really, at the end of the day, the things that make up our lives. And then really interesting his look, and he's kind of saying, he sees both sides of it, but when it comes to beautiful treasures like those quilts, do you keep them packed away, or do you use them every day and wear them out? And I can see both sides of it. I certainly see what he's saying. Well, if those women didn't keep them, packed up in the trunks and only take them out for special occasions, then they would have just got ruined from use and washing and dirty kids and, all those kind of things. And so it's good that they did, so we can see those beautiful examples. But then I also see the other side of using it and enjoying it, not just saving it for somebody else. So I don't know. That's one I guess people have to make up for their own self, whether they do or not, whether they use it or whether they preserve it for future generations. I was reminded, Matt's mother, Miss Cindy, she shared so many things of her grandmothers with me after me and Matt were married, and one of them was a set. It wasn't a complete set, but a few pieces of a set of depression glass that she had. Well, one of them was an amber color pitcher. Well, there was two. There was a small one and a big one. But I started using the pitcher because I was kind of thinking like that. Well, why would I? Corey and Katie was, by this point when I started using it, probably they were little kids, but I thought maybe even too little to even get the pitcher and pour out of it or anything. But I thought, well, who knows? They may grow up to really like these things, or they may not. They may throw them in the trash, so I might as well just use them. And so I used that for a long time for tea. That was in the days when I made sweet tea a lot. And I remember one of my friends at the time, an older lady that collected, really was very knowledgeable about depression glass. And she found out that I was using it for that, and she was like, oh my goodness, you can't do that. You can't do that. You got to save that. Do you know how fragile it is? Do you know how precious that is? And I remember she even went so far, she was even so concerned about it that she went to the dollar store and bought me a plastic pitcher and gave it to me and said, now here, use your sweet tea. You use it for this. Don't you use that glass no more. And I actually did listen to her. I quit using it, and I have it up on top of my cabinets now up there, so at least I can see it. But that is something I've thought about, the things that we pack away. They're mementos and they're precious because they were our grandparents or our parents or our aunts or something we picked up somewhere that's really precious. And then do you just keep it stored away, or do you pull it out and use it? Like I said, there's different ways to look at that. Another friend told me, blind pig reader, that when him and his wife were first married, they brought his mother come back to where he grew up, to visit the mother, and they brought her this beautiful, beautiful set of china because he just knew it would please. She never had much. She was poor, and he just knew it would please her. Well, it did. She loved it. But he said as far as he knew, for the rest of her life, she never used it. She just kept it in the back bedroom, and if somebody come, she would, that didn't know about it, she'd take them back there and show it to them and brag about it, but she never used it. It was just too pretty to use. And so, I don't know, there's real sweetness in that, but then there's the other side where you think, well, maybe she should have just used it every day and enjoyed it. Different ways, though, to look at it, and certainly everyone has their own preference. And I do see his point, though. If some people didn't keep them back and take care of them, then there'd be none of those artifacts for us to enjoy today. So, lots to think about in this part of the book. I hope you'll leave a comment and tell me what jumped out at you and what you enjoyed in this part. And I hope you'll drop back by next Friday, so we'll see what John talks about next.